So you pick your elements. I've got DSL access, DSL shelf, DSL chassis. You pick your variants. If you've got template replication, you pick some results. And finally you can pick scenarios. I go to the scenarios tab, and in the same way that there can be many elements if you're using template replication, scenarios can also be very, very numerous if you use multiple dimensions. So there is a linear selection checkbox down here which should be checked by default, and by default it will list the working model and all of the actual available scenarios, i.e. the combinations of the different dimensions, in a single flat list, just like it does in 7.4, and you can pick individual scenarios like you used to and move them into the list over here, and that works exactly like it did before. And to be honest with you, if you have only one dimension, that's perfect. If you have two dimensions, if it's only a few like this, it's still pretty manageable. But it's when you get into 3 and more dimensions that it starts getting crazy, because you end up with this number explodes combinatorically. You have far too many, and you get it's typically you want to pick the same things across dimensions, and it's just silly doing it in a linear space. So if I remove these, then the alternative is I can uncheck linear selection, and it then presents a so-called dimensional view, which lists first of all the working model, and then by each dimension it lists the respective variants for those dimensions. Now again, rather like the variants tab, if I don't select any variants at all, then if there's nothing selected at all, then the graph I will get will be as if I had just selected the working model. Working model exists here so that if you do pick some variants, you can then explicitly pick working model as well to say, yes, I'd like to include that on my graph. But if you pick nothing at all, the default will be to just get the working model. Otherwise, if I don't pick something in one dimension, and let's say I pick base from video on off, then the way to think of this is when I say base, I want everything that goes with base. So if I go click on here, that's actually going to mean give me DSL base, WiMAX base, and dual base. It's the base sliced through that space. And if I go back, conversely, if I wanted to specifically have, let's say, just DSL and WiMAX and base, then I'd pick those elements from the separate dimensions, and again it'll pick off the relevant combinations, and it'll just give me those two. So again, you need to play with this to get a feel for it, but the idea is to make it as easy as possible to get those kinds of slices. If you have 3 dimensions, you can imagine that if you only said base out of 2 dimensions, then it would be base times everything in the other 2, so it would be a whole square of results. And you might pick, I don't know, conversely you might pick, if you had 3 dimensions, you might specify 2 of them and leave the other one blank, in which case you'd have 2 particular points, and it would be a line, so it would be 3 or 4 results, which is probably the more common thing. So the idea is that you can skip one of these dimensions, because very often you're wanting to say, I'd like to have everything in one dimension for one particular point in the other. So in the DSL model, a lot of the basic results, all we care about is the base video scenario. So if I just select that, then by default, as I say, it's going to give me the 3 combinations to go with it. And also, as I say, if you want to have the working model on the graph, then you just select it here and add it to the mix. Again, I think that should appear at the top, but that's just a little bug. Yeah, so basically all of the implied combinations are then selected. Ultimately, it's the individual scenarios you're picking here, so you can always pick one of them and remove it, and it's ultimately a flat selection it works with. It's just that dimensional view is an easier way to rapidly select a logical subset of the dimensional space. So as I say, if you have nothing selected here, then by default you'll get a graph of the working model. Alternatively, and again by analogy with the other ones, if I have picked some particular scenarios and I'm happy with this selection, if I want to temporarily ignore that, then I can also check this box, and if temporary disregard selection is checked, it also means ignore all scenarios and just give me working model results. So you can get working model results either by picking nothing, or by saying, well, I picked something but I want to temporarily ignore it. Again, to keep things simple, the scenarios tab is hidden if no scenarios, i.e. no dimensions, have been defined in the model, but it's not hidden if the scenarios haven't been run. So suppose your scenarios haven't been run, they're all out of date, but you decided you wanted to still draw a graph which would then update later when you did rerun those scenarios. Then if you check the box here saying include out-of-date scenarios, it will show them all the ones that could be available. You can draw the graph, the lines will be currently unavailable, and then when you subsequently run the model, they will then come to life. By default, that's not checked, and the idea is that it will only show the scenarios here which are actually available. Now, I know how that works. If it's a linear selection, I'm not quite sure how that works. With the dimensional one, maybe it always shows all the options, I'm not quite sure. And again, there is a separate graphs option which, like all the other ones, will not be checked by default. So like everything else, the idea is it'll only draw one graph unless you specifically ask it to explode one or more of those tab dimensions into separate graphs. Hopefully this is going to be make working with multiple dimensions much more logical, satisfying and straightforward than the way it currently is in 7.4, where, to be honest, it becomes a bit of a mess if you have multiple dimensions.